Good morning. I'm going to begin with an acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge the territory we are on. I acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory we are on, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue. British Columbia's 42nd provincial election will be unique in many ways. BC has never held an election during a global pandemic before, though elections have taken place previously during provincial emergencies. Worldwide, more than 50 elections have taken place this year, and over 185 million people have voted. Between March 2nd and April 15th alone, at the height of the initial wave of the pandemic, 17 elections were held at national, subnational, and local levels. And in Canada, British Columbia went to the polls on September 14, and Saskatchewan is scheduled to vote on October 26. So while this is new for British Columbia, elections have taken place successfully in many jurisdictions during the pandemic. In any election, accessibility and integrity are key areas of focus for Elections BC. We work to make sure that voters have the information they need to vote, and we help them do so by providing a wide variety of voting opportunities. We also ensure that only eligible voters vote and that they only vote once. British Columbia has the most accessible voting model in Canada. Voters can vote throughout the campaign period, at election offices, during advance voting, and on voting day, and by mail. They have the option of voting at their assigned opportunity, or they can vote at any voting place in the province on voting days. And we send teams of election officials to bring the ballot to remote communities, work camps, and healthcare facilities. Our voting model also has a number of core checks and balances to ensure electoral integrity. Voters show ID before they vote. Voters who vote before Election Day are struck off the voters list, preventing them from voting again. And all absentee ballots, including mail-in ballots, go through a rigorous screening process before they can be counted. These aspects are essential elements of our trusted and accessible electoral model. In this election, however, we also have additional critical responsibility to provide safe voting opportunities. Since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been working with Dr. Henry's office to better understand the pandemic and how public health requirements and COVID-19 preventive measures will impact our electoral processes. I'm confident that with our safe voting plans in place, this election can be held safely during this pandemic. Voting in person will be different from past elections, but the differences will be familiar to us at this stage. In voting places, voters can expect physical distancing, hand sanitizer stations, capacity limits, protective barriers for election officials, and election officials wearing personal protective equipment. In this election, there will be more voting opportunities for voters across more voting days. Most voters will likely only spend minutes inside a voting place. Casting your vote be like getting a takeout coffee or picking up milk and eggs from the grocery store in terms of the safety protocols and time spent. I ask all voters to do their part to help ensure a safe election. If you're feeling sick or self-isolating, contact us about your remote voting options. Our 1-800 number, 1-800-661-8683, or go online, www.elections.bc.ca. For voters who vote in person, please follow the instructions of the election officials. We ask that voters remain kind, patient, and calm, and respectful of the safety of our election workers. Elections BC is here to help voters vote safely during the pandemic. We encourage all voters to participate, and I will continue to work with Dr. Henry's office throughout the campaign period to ensure a safe and accessible process. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. Like many, many aspects of our society, much thought and consideration has gone into ensuring British Columbians can safely vote this fall. We have collaborated with Elections BC, chief electoral offices around the province, as well as an all-party committee of the legislature called the Elections Advisory Committee, to make sure that COVID safety plans are in place throughout. To be clear, our work has not been because we were expecting an election, but because we knew COVID-19 would be in our communities for some time to come, and we needed to be ready, whether it was municipal, provincial, or federal elections that might come. We needed to ensure any election in BC could happen safely. It is such an integral part of our democratic process to be able to vote. We have provided guidance for political parties and their candidates, that they need to keep themselves, their staff, volunteers, and local communities safe during the campaign. And like many other activities, the campaign and voting process requires COVID-19 safety plans, as we've just heard. Similar to what you see in other locations, the layers of protections, things like spacing, cleaning, one-way paths, ensuring efficiency so that you're not in the space for a long period of time, will still need to be in place. Elections BC has worked hard to ensure everyone can get to the polls and exercise their right to vote safely, whether it is a local polling station or in a long-term care home or hospital. COVID-19 continues to challenge all of us, and I commend Elections BC for the work they've done in helping us all prepare to do this safely. I encourage all candidates to pay attention to their interactions in the coming week and always put the safety of themselves and those around them first, and encourage everyone in the coming weeks to do vote. Get out there, exercise your important democratic right. Elections are key to our democracy, and we will be working together with Elections BC and with our communities over the next 6 weeks to ensure this can happen safely for everyone in BC. Thank you, and we'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. As a reminder to media on the phone, please press *1 to enter the queue. You are limited to one question and one follow-up only. Please also take your phones off mute. You will not be audible until I call your name. First question this morning is from John Woodward, CTV.
Hi there. We've been told we're looking at an extremely high number of mail-in ballots, maybe north of the 40% range, and wondering whether that is expected to delay the actual tallying of the election results tonight.
Thank you for the question. Yes, our survey work that we conducted over the summer months consistently put the range of 35 to 40% of British Columbians who expressed an interest in voting by mail, one of the state remote voting options that we have in BC. I know over the first less than 24 hours, we've already received approximately 20,000 requests for vote by mail packages since the election was called. BC has always had 2 counts, at least since the Act was changed in 1996. We have initial count on voting day, which is a count of all the advance voting ballots and all of the ballots cast on voting day. These are considered live ballots. They go directly into the ballot box, and that results are announced following the completion of their count on initial count on election night. We have final count, which is a count of all absentee ballots, which cannot begin until a minimum of 13 days following election day. This is when all absentee ballots are counted, including vote by mail ballots. The duration of time between initial count and final count is critical to the integrity of the electoral process. During this time, we screen all of the absentee ballots to make sure that the voter who cast them is registered, is voting correctly in their electoral district, and has not voted previously in the election. Because of this requirement to ensure only one vote per voter, this cannot take place until following the close of voting on general voting day. If there are a significant amount of absentee ballots, including vote by mail ballots, the preparation time before final count may take longer. We don't know what that may be because we do not know the volume of the absentee ballots and vote by mail ballots that will be cast during this election. But our commitment is to make sure that the count is conducted as quickly as possible, that all the necessary integrity checks are made, and that the results are reported as soon as we can. Thank you.
Do you have a follow-up question, John? Okay, moving on. April Lawrence, Check News.
Oh, hi there. Thank you. I'm just wondering, with the amount of public interaction that will go with staffing polling station and the increased risk that comes with it during a pandemic, are you anticipating any struggle finding enough people that will be willing to do that work?
That is a good question. I know that that is a concern that all election bodies across Canada have been discussing over the past number of months as we grappled with how the pandemic will impact our electoral processes. We've done a few things, I think both procedural-wise as well as changes to the legislation that put a voting day on a Saturday that will hopefully help us maintain and be able to recruit the election officials that we need to recruit. Previously, voting day being on a Tuesday had a much reduced work pool that could potentially vote. Most voters were at work during the day and were not available to work. On a Saturday, of course, that changes, and there's a greater opportunity for those citizens who wish to work to support their democracy to do so. We've also are targeting recruitment efforts at youth. We have a Youth at the Booth program that we administer through the schools and looking at targeting students and others. We've also examined our own processes. Bill 43, which was the Election Amendment Act passed by the legislature in November of 2019, introduced a number of changes that, while not in effect for this election, show the way that how voting could be administered in the future. One of those things was a revised staffing model, which only had one election official at each voting station. This is something that we have put in place for this election that will reduce the numbers of election officials that are required, but will also allow them to perform their critical tasks in a physically distanced manner. So while it is something that we're watching, I believe that the changes we have put in place will enable us to recruit the election officials that we need to administer the election.
April, do you have a follow-up?
I do. Just on the telephone voting option, I'm wondering if you've done any surveys as far as anticipating how many people will choose that option, and if you can just run through how that might actually work.
And certainly, we haven't done any surveys in relation to that option. Telephone voting is a type of voting that was put in place prior to the 2017 general election under the special voting rules in our legislation. It was intended as a way to enable voters who had a permanent or semi-permanent disability that prevented them from voting independently to cast a ballot independently. It's operator assisted. The voter must be registered correctly before they try to use this method. It's available after the close of nominations. A voter will call into the contact center. They will authenticate who they are verbally with that operator, and then they will get passed on anonymously to the two telephone voting operators who will assist them in marking their ballot. Because of this anonymous passing on of that voter to them, the vote remains secret. We believe it is an excellent opportunity for voters who cannot vote independently, but provides us with much more flexibility in this election as a possible use in acute care hospitals for individuals who are self-isolating and other individuals who meet these new criteria. In terms of capacity, we have brought on additional capacity to be able to address this voting option, but we don't know what the requests are going to be and what percentage of voters may be looking at using it. I would like to reinforce, though, it is not an option that's available to any voter in British Columbia. The remote voting option available to any voter is vote by mail. This is a unique opportunity that's available to those who again have a permanent, semi-permanent disability that prevents them from voting independently, or in certain unique circumstances that arise out of the pandemic.
Jeff Andreas, Radio NL.
Hi, thanks. I was just wondering if there is some sort of crazy rise in active cases of COVID-19, does public health have the authority or ability to postpone an election date?
The short answer is, and I think perhaps Anton can answer this as well, that there's 87, I believe, different elections that are happening. So we would be involved in assessing risk in all situations. So if there was something major, I think we have looked at all of the foreseen potentials, but if there was some reason in some community that certain voting places couldn't be used or that there was challenges because of the pandemic, then we would work with Elections BC and make sure that we had provisions in place to be able to take whatever modifications were needed. This does, of course, remind us all how important it is for all of these important things in our society right now that we need to continue to take those measures that prevent transmission of infection in communities right now for all of us. And that includes, maintaining our safe distances, wearing masks, cleaning our hands, making sure that if we're not feeling well, that we stay away from others and stay home until it's assessed, and getting tested when needed. So these are all important things that we all need to do every day, but now more than ever, there are important things going on right now, including people going back to work, going back to school, and now, of course, this election. So we'll be monitoring very carefully and working closely with Elections BC to make sure that everything is safe.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I guess just how closely also are you going to be monitoring campaign events to ensure that they are, abiding by the rules around crowd sizes, and also, I guess, can fines be levied or events be halted if candidates aren't following rules here?
Yeah, so we have talked with, as I mentioned, with the Electoral Advisory Committee, which is made up of members of each of the political parties, and they have to have their COVID safety plan in place. And we are, like every other business or organization, we expect them to follow those plans. Certainly, if we hear of concerns or complaints, we have public health inspectors in every region that can enforce. We have others who can enforce the orders, particularly around gatherings, but I do expect that all parties will be committed to doing this safely for the sake of their own candidates and staff, but also to ensure that this election can happen freely and fairly and safely in our communities.
Next question is from Tanya Fletcher, CBC.
Thank you. If people are being told not to vote in person, if they're self-isolating or have symptoms, and to ask for a mail package, how quickly can those get out to people? As in, what happens if you get sick the day before October 24th, say?
Thank you. So obviously vote by mail, by its very description, entails sending voting packages in the mail, but that's not the only way that voters can get their voting packages. They can be issued by local district electoral offices. They can be issued up until 4 hours prior to the close of voting on voting day. So it's possible for if someone becomes sick the day before, they could call into that office and have a friend or family member pick up the voting package for them. They could fill it out and they could return it back to the office. I had also mentioned when I responded to the question about operator-assisted telephone voting that that model was considered as an option for those unique circumstances where voters were prevented from voting because of something like being required to be self-isolating or that they are sick. So that, again, would be a circumstance where that may apply, and we would just encourage that voter to contact us in order to see what their options were. Our goal is to make sure that we do have accessible options for all British Columbians.
Do you have a follow-up, Tanya?
Please, thanks. Was there ever a consideration to simply send a voting package to all registered voters? Would that not perhaps have streamlined this process now, and having to request and have staff on hand to get those packages out in the few weeks remaining?
Yeah, so we had a lot of discussions internally at Elections BC about what would the optimal model be for an election. Obviously, we're guided, and we must administer an election according to the legislation that is in place. The legislation for elections in British Columbia does not contemplate sending mail-in ballots to everyone. That was a model that was used for provincial referenda that was administered according to the Referendum Act and specific legislation and regulation that were put in place for those events. It is a model that is used elsewhere in the world. In the States in particular, there's a number of states that are completely vote-by-mail states. But for this election, the best approach that we thought we could have would be to maintain the voting opportunities that are available in person, as well as providing the ability for voters to request their voting packages.
Next question is from Vaughn Palmer, Vancouver Sun.
Good day, Dr. Henry. This is a question for you. Yesterday, your counterpart in Quebec said that his province is, quote, at the start of a second wave. Is it possible that in British Columbia, where cases are also on the rise, that we are also at the start of a second wave?
It certainly is possible, and I think that's how Horacio qualified it as well, that it is concerning that they were seeing, and I will stress that they were seeing quite a rapid increase in numbers over a short period of time. As you know, we've had a gradual increase in our numbers, and it's slowly rising to a number that we would prefer not to have. But as we know, we were watching a number of different indicators, including numbers of cases, of course, but also how many of them are linked, how many cases are not being able to be linked to known cases or clusters. We look at our hospitalizations and our ICU cases as well. So we are certainly in a resurgence, and I've said that whether it is for us, it is very similar to, I mean, it could be a second wave, if you want to call it that. I think we are in this, as I've said many times, for a long haul, and we need to find that balance of being able to carry out activities that are important for our health and well-being of our communities, whether that's work or school or elections, as well as maintaining our control over cases of COVID in our communities. So it is going to be with us for some time, and we need to be able to continue to find that balance, and that means we all need to do our part. So I think it's slightly semantics to say whether it is a second wave or not. It's certainly numbers that we were seeing that were similar to our first wave, which we managed to suppress very effectively here in BC, and I believe we can continue to keep this low and slow as well as we move into the fall.
Do you have a follow-up, Vaughn?
Yes, please. Dr. Henry, you've been warning for months about the likelihood of a second wave. Would it not have been more prudent to put off calling an early election until we know how the second wave is going to unfold?
As you know, Vaughn, it's not my job to call an election. That is part of our democratic political process, and those decisions were made with the knowledge of what was going on. It's my job to make sure that we can continue to do the important things in our community that we need to do. And we have been watching this for some time. We know that this increase has been slow and steady over the last number of weeks. I also watch very carefully my public health colleagues, what we're doing, how we are able to manage the contact tracing, finding people, the indicators that I just mentioned, as well as monitoring our healthcare system to make sure that we can continue with things like our surgical renewal, that people are able to access the health care they need. And we are in that place right now where we are at a balance, but we are always concerned when we have cases circulating that we need to reset and continue to monitor ourselves to make sure that we can keep in place the things that we know work to prevent the transmission of this virus. And I've said a number of times over the last few weeks, as we're heading into the fall, we need to be concerned about respiratory season. We know that influenza starts to hit us usually in November, December, and so those are things that we need to prepare for as well. So now's our time to take a step back, to make sure that we're keeping steady with the things that we're doing, and to continue to do the measures that we know work to prevent transmission.
Lisa Houston, News 1130.
I'm hoping, please, Mr. Boegman, that you can talk about the counts, and that if we get these 800,000 mail-in ballots, what that will mean to when we get to see the final results, and how we will get them riding by riding or as the results come in.
Sure. So the way that final count starts is that when all districts in the province are ready to begin final count, we begin the count of those ballots. The results are reported in a very similar way to how they're reported on election night, with as the results are counted by the teams, they're uploaded into our voting results system, and that's provided online in real time throughout the duration of that final count. On the conclusion of final count, the district electoral officer in each district will declare the elected candidate for that district. So there will, of course, as I said, there's a number of activities that have to take place in order to ensure the integrity of that final count, to make sure that all absentee ballots and mail-in ballots were cast by eligible voters, and that those voters did not vote at another opportunity. So that process, which takes 13 days in legislation at a minimum, it was designed probably in 1996 for, I would say, tens of thousands of ballots. We have managed to take that process and introduce efficiencies to be able to accommodate 200,000. If there's 800,000, it will take longer. I don't know how much longer, but it will take longer. And as I said before, our commitment is to make sure that the count is conducted as quickly as possible while maintaining the necessary integrity checks. Once final count begins, though, the results will be uploaded in a live fashion on our website.
Lisa, do you have a follow-up?
I do. Speaking of looking at voting locations, schools the teachers union has expressed concern about using schools as voting locations, and also sometimes seniors' homes have been used, or areas that seniors or children have access to. So I'm wondering if you could talk about specific concern that teachers have, how vital schools are. It was mentioned in the tech briefing. I'm hoping you can mention it now, how many schools are used, and just how you're dealing with that concern and going forward.
So schools are vital to the electoral process in British Columbia. That's recognized in legislation, which gives me and Elections BC access to schools as we need them for voting places. I recognize that there are concerns, and those are very real concerns. And for those reasons, when in our planning, we did make sure that we spoke with staff at the Ministry of Education and with Dr. Henry's office about how to integrate our safe voting plans with the safe school plans. In recognition of that, we are going to limit our use of schools to weekend days. So the first weekend of advance voting, a Saturday and Sunday, and then on voting day, which is on a Saturday. So these are days when students are not present in the schools, when it's possible to make sure that the necessary cleaning is done before and after the use of these facilities by voters. But to give you an example of the importance, in the last election on voting day, 44% of all voting locations across British Columbia were in schools.
Thank you. Next question is from Sean Eckford, Coast Reporter.
Thank you. I was hoping you might be able to talk a little bit about any unique challenges you foresaw in planning for the big rural ridings within the province.
Our approach is that there are 87 electoral districts in British Columbia, and each one has its own unique demographics and has its own unique geographic features. So, of course, the rural districts are very different than the urban districts. For these reasons, part of the key role that the district electoral officers play is to develop their own unique approaches and plans for how they're going to be administering voting in these locations. They're reflective of the larger spaces, the ability to place advanced voting days, perhaps not for the entire 7-day period in some locations, but there may be one day here and one day there to provide that opportunity to the way the populations are spread out. A lot of the work that they do is directly in consultation with community groups within those districts to understand what their needs are and how best to make sure that the voting opportunities that are planned will meet the needs of those voters.
Do you have a follow-up, Sean?
Yes, please. Just a quick one. With respect to some of those more spread out ridings in the province, the candidates obviously are going to have to find unique ways to campaign, and some of that may involve technology and extra expenses. Was any thought given to being a little more flexible about candidate expenses limits during this election because of the unique challenges of campaigning during a pandemic?
We did consider candidate expenses limits, which of course are set in legislation. And we did make some allowances for them, but those allowances were in relation to their purchase and use of protective equipment that is necessary to maintain safe working places for them. Those expenses for those types of things, as long as they are not branded, are exempt from the spending limits. Campaigns have been using technology quite pervasively over the last number of elections, and our sense was that we did not need to make an adjustment for those areas in this election.
Next question is from Richard Zussman, Global News.
Dr. Henry, sort of along the lines of the question that Vaughn was asking earlier, you have said many times that things could potentially be safer in the spring. The weather is a bit better, people can go outside, lower risk of transmission. Would it have been better to have an election in the spring than in the fall because of all those warnings we have constantly heard from you?
I cannot speculate on where we're going to be. What we do know is this virus is going to be with us for some time. And we've also known that we have to treat it with humility. We actually cannot predict what the fall is going to look like. We cannot predict what our winter is going to look like or what the spring is going to look like. So, my focus right now is ensuring that we continue to respond to this pandemic, that I will continue to focus all of our energies on making sure that we're doing everything we can to manage this virus while we are ensuring that important things for the wellness of our community continue, and that includes people going back to work, going back to school, having important functions of our democratic process like elections whenever they occur.
Richard, do you have a follow-up?
I do. I'm just wondering, we're working on a story about a COVID case involving a teacher in Coastal Health where she believes that she has contracted the virus from a student. She wasn't informed by Public Health. There's been no posting on the Coastal Health website. Is it still okay that Coastal Health is not publicly reporting cases in the school system? And has it been put on your radar yet that there has been a possible exposure in a Coastal Health school?
Yes, I am aware of that, and I know that Vancouver Coastal is still investigating the circumstances of both what we hear through the media around the teacher and the another exposure event in the school. I understand that it is posted, or at least it will be by by today. Vancouver Coastal wanted to ensure that the school family was notified first before it was posted. So there was a bit of a delay, unfortunately. So I know they are investigating the circumstances around both of those occasions, and we don't yet have the answers for that.
Next question is from Mary Brooks, Island Social Trends.
Hi, thanks. I'm looking at the mail-in ballot process, and you've said that about 20,000 people have already applied online to order their mail-on ballots. And then it sounds like people have to write in the name of the candidate on those ballots. They'll be blank because we don't yet know who the candidates are. And from what I remember from previous elections, if there was a mistake in entering the candidate's name, it was misspelled or it was incomplete, that would spoil the ballot. So I'm just wondering what danger there is for a large number of spoiled ballots from the use of mail-in?
Certainly, in a write-in ballot, there is a greater risk that a voter could put something that is not correct on that ballot. Our instructions are very clear in that the voter can mark the name of the registered political party that they wish to vote for or the name of a candidate in their district. For those reasons, following the close of nominations for our mail-in ballots, we are switching to providing ones that get requested following that point with ordinary ballots. So these have the name of the candidates that are listed in their district, and they simply need to mark off the space next to the candidate that they wish to vote for. Our instructions are very clear around this. Our 1-800 contact center will be able to respond to any questions that voters have. But for those voters that request a package early, they will be getting a write-in ballot. And it's very important that when they mark that ballot, that they mark it either for the political party of choice or for the candidate that they know will be running in their district. We do have a lot of ability to look at the individual marks on the ballot. And if there is, for instance, a spelling error, but it's still clear what the voter's intent is, then we will accept that ballot as a vote cast for that candidate. So we do have flexibility. And when we review ballots as we count them, we're able to look at the voter's intent and make decisions accordingly.
Mary, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. So for the 13 days that need to be waited to start counting the absentee ballots and the mail-in ballots, is it conceivable that, given the volume of that number of ballots, that BC could go without a confirmed government in place for some period of time?
It is conceivable, yes. As I said, our focus will be on making sure that we are able to apply the most resources that we can to the issue and to try to have a speedy count as possible. In BC, since the Act was changed in 1996, there's always been a delay. Over the time of a number of elections, we've seen voter patterns change, voters moving from voting 90 to 95% of them on voting day to the last election there was under 60% voted on voting day, 30% voted advance voting, and 10% voted using some kind of absentee model. So in the last election, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but there were quite a number of ridings where the number of absentee ballots to be counted was greater than the margin between the top two candidates. So it is possible that there will be a delay before the final results are known. Our commitment, again, is to make sure that the count is conducted as quickly as possible while maintaining the necessary integrity checks.
Next question is from Shannon Waters, BC Today.
Hi, I'm curious about the rules for parties conducting their campaign safely. Are those posted publicly somewhere?
So I have instructed each of the parties to develop their COVID safety plans, and I would expect them to be posted publicly. That's a very good question. I'm not aware if they have yet or not. I know that we've been asked to review, my office has been asked to review some plans, but I would expect that to happen in the coming days. Yes, thanks for that.
Shannon, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, please. Dr. Henry, I'm wondering if those rules include guidance for reporters potentially attending these events. NDP leader Horgan has an avail today in North Vancouver. Reporters are allowed to come there, expected to wear masks and physically distance, but I note that the availability for this morning's event said that in order to comply with physical distancing guidelines from the BC CDC, reporters must call into this event. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of explain that discrepancy, if there is one. Like, how is it safe for campaigns to have reporters in person, but for events like this, it's not workable?
Yeah, well, we are, I don't know if you've been here, but this has been the process that we've had here from for quite some time. This is quite a small room, and the ability to have everybody here is not possible. So when some of the events, particularly outside, and this is the guidance that we've been talking to people about, ensuring that people can maintain safe physical distance, that there's small enough numbers. So I would expect that any event being held would have less than 50 people, even outside. So those are the types of guidance that will be included in the safety plans. But for today's event, it's not physically possible to have people in this room safely.
Thank you. Next question is from Lisa Cordasco, CHLY.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm just wondering about the parties' safety plans. First of all, have they been submitted, and what sort of common elements do you want to see in them?
Yeah, so our discussions with the Elections Advisory Committee, which is made up of the parties, is around things to protect their workers if they're doing canvassing, the provisions they have in place in their electoral offices or in the candidates' offices to make sure that they have a minimum number of people, they maintain distance, they have physical barriers in place. There's guidance around door-to-door canvassing and how that could be done safely, and I've asked them to put in provisions for making sure that if they're doing door-to-door in apartment buildings, that they have appropriate safety measures in place. So there's a variety of guidance like we have for every other business, where we've given parameters and we've said to them that they need to develop their own safety plans within those parameters. I also think it's very important to recognize that there are many people who will not want somebody to come to their door during this period of time, and I've asked each of the parties to consider how they will allow people to make that clear so that they're not interrupting people who don't want to be canvassed at the door. So those are some of the things that we've been looking at. As with every sector, there are things that political parties know more about than I do around the activities that they undertake during an election campaign. So we've given basic parameters, and we're looking to them to make sure that their COVID safety plans are appropriate.
Do you have a follow-up, Lisa?
Yes, Rob Shaw, I hope you don't mind, but you raised a very interesting question in the technical briefing, and I would like to get somebody to speak on the record, speak to how the counting process would have been affected if an election was held in October of 2021, specifically, amendments to the Election Act.
Certainly. So the Election Amendment Act 2019 introduced a number of changes, future changes to electoral processes in British Columbia. These were based on reports that my predecessor had submitted and that indicated that there were different ways that we could modernize the electoral process, in particular by introducing more technology to how voting is administered in British Columbia. Our model is based on the model that's in place in Ontario right now. That would involve the use of electronic voting books that are connected through a secure network across the province. When a voter would attend to vote, they would be struck off the voters list at that time. They would receive their ballot either for their district or an ordinary ballot for, if they're out of district, it would be printed on demand for them. That ballot would be tabulated in a tabulator as they left the voting place, and then following the conclusion of voting on election night, the results would be computed and made available. So in Ontario, the results were posted within 15 minutes of the close of voting using this model. That doesn't mean that all results were posted. Certainly the ones from those voting places that had tabulators were posted. There were a number of voting locations in Ontario that operated under their traditional model, and in BC it would likely be similar, that there would be some locations where it's not feasible to use that type of technology that would have to be counted in a different fashion. But certainly, using that technology, the results would be known sooner.
We have time for a couple more questions. Next question is from Nelson Bennett, Business in Vancouver.
Yeah, apologies if this question was asked earlier during the technical briefing. I got cut off. I think it was my phone. But just to be clear, there's about a 2-week period before you even start counting the mail-in ballots. So it could be, 3-4 weeks before we actually have a final result?
So in British Columbia, in previous elections, the final result was not declared until typically at a minimum of 17 days after voting day. If there are more absentee ballots, significantly more, it's going to take longer. I don't know how much longer it will be. Obviously, as I've said before, our focus is on making sure that our processes to screen those ballots are as efficient as possible and that the necessary integrity checks are made. Until we know how many ballots will be present, we're not going to be able to determine whether an extension to that 13-day period is necessary in order to prepare the ballots for counting.
Nelson, do you have a follow-up?
No, I think that answers it. So we're looking at least 3 weeks.
Give or take, yes. As I said, the Act contemplates a minimum 13-day period to get ready, and then there's a 3-day period for the final count to take place. So that is what it was in 2017, in 2013, 2009, and 2005.
Last question this morning is from Ian Bailey, Globe and Mail.
Forgive me, maybe if I'm being a bit confused. Will you know on election night who has won the election?
On election night, we will have a count of all of the ballots that were cast during advance voting and during general voting day. Typically in election, this equates to around 90% of the ballots. If there are significant demand for vote by mail and other absentee ballots in this election, then obviously those percentages will change. The initial count is always an initial count. It's only a count of the ballots, as I've said, from general voting and advance voting. The final count is when the official results are declared.
Do you have a follow-up, Ian?
Yes, a question to both of you and a question from the background briefing to both of you. What's your confidence level on whether this is going to work, and what are the possible issues and foreseeable problems that may prevent you from successfully executing all of this stuff that you've described in the last bit?
I have a high level of confidence in the electoral processes that we put in place in our field teams and in the staff at Elections BC headquarters to administer a safe election. I have a high degree of confidence in the guidance that we've received from Dr. Henry's office and in the approach that's being put in place for this election. Our mandate is to be ready to administer an election when required, and I believe we have achieved that mandate.
Thank you. You know, this is something that we have contemplated from the very beginning of this. There was municipal elections that were scheduled for March and early April, and we had discussions very early on about timing and about the uncertainty of the situation we were facing then. We know a lot more about this pandemic now. We don't know everything, and so we cannot for certainty predict what's going to happen, but I have a high degree of confidence that we're doing what we need to do in British Columbia. We are controlling as much as we can the virus. We all need to continue to do our part, and that the plans that we have in place will allow this election to happen and our important democratic process to occur during this very trying and challenging year. So thank you very much.
That's all the time we have today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.